So let's look on page 118 at the Sacrament of Matrimony. The goal of this session is, the purpose of this session is to help the engaged couple understand clearly God's vision for the Sacrament of Matrimony. The call of matrimony goes far beyond the rights and obligations associated with a civil marriage. Indeed, it is a call to covenant love, a love that cannot be negotiated away. Covenant love in marriage must witness to the world the faithful, constant love between Christ and the church. This presentation is also intended to help the couple understand the importance of the practice of faith to their marriage. The emphasis is on Jesus Christ as the invisible third partner in their marriage. Okay, so in terms of the homework, usually, I would say more often than not, we have the priest or deacon with us for this last session. We really encourage them to come because it's a perfect time for us to accomplish a few things. First of all, it's a perfect time for us to now give the couple back to them. It's the handoff, you know. Now we're giving them back to the priest or deacon, and we're finished with them. It's also a time for us to, as a married couple, and the priest or deacon to talk about holy orders and matrimony as the two lifestyle sacraments of the church. So to have us both together, the couple and the one that has holy orders, is a great reflection of sacrament. And it also helps the engaged couple to feel like the priest or deacon is really invested in their relationship, you know, when they show up for that. So we try to give especially if the priest is with us, we try to involve them in any way that we can. And in the discussion of the homework, you'll see on some of the homework exercises, they ask questions like, one of the times I felt closest to God was, I'll just say, that's on page 134B. One of the times I felt closest to God was, and so as the engaged couple shares a time they were close to God, sometimes we'll share a moment, or the priest might share a moment he was close to God. I once felt the hand of God in my life, or a sacred place I have been. That's on the Sacrament of Matrimony handout. A sacred place I've been. That's usually one that everybody shares. The engaged couple will talk a little bit, and then the priest will often say some place that's sacred to him, or we'll each share on ours. So we try to make that sharing of homework.
The covenant one, the first one, has some good stuff on covenant, understanding, you know, the model of covenant versus contract. So again, that's a wonderful opportunity for the priest or deacon to jump in and sort of clarify that our idea of marriage is that it's based on this covenant, this, you know, unbreakable commitment, much like God gives a covenant to his people, versus this contract that says, the scales are equal and equal rights and obligations, and so it's a totally different model. So you can do a little bit of teaching as you go through the homeworks, particularly if the priest or deacon is there.
So you're going to share on all the homeworks except for the letter, okay, at this point. So we're on page 119, and Lloyd's going to start the teaching now on the understanding of sacrament, but that's how you're going to be sharing the homework, and it's all in there. You're just not going to share the letters at that point. And then we go into the teaching on sacrament.
Yeah. So if the priest or deacon is with us, I might ask them to cover some of this stuff on sacrament here that's on page 120. But if not, I'll just cover it directly. So we'll just give you a little flavor for how we get into the topic. So I usually will say something like, as you look back on our time together, a lot of the topics that we dealt with early on were topics that could have been dealt with in a secular setting, whether it was the influence of family of origin or some communication patterns, conflict resolution, but clearly you see toward the last several weeks it's been more and more faith-oriented. We're really trying to understand what it means that you're getting married in the church, that you're asking God to be part of your marriage. And so tonight, we come to a conclusion with this climax of what does it really mean that you're entering into the sacrament of matrimony? Why is it different for you versus that couple friend of yours who might be great folks who just want to get married on the beach. You're saying something profoundly different. What are we saying by saying we want to enter into the sacrament of matrimony? And we've talked about that. We've thrown that term around back and forth, sacrament, 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 but it might be helpful to kind of review, what do we mean when we say sacrament? What are we really talking about? So I will usually explain this on page 120 like this. So I said, when you look at it, Jesus knew human nature so well that instead of, when he wanted to teach people, he didn't speak in these pious, abstract platitudes, philosophical terms about, being and essence and things like that. What did he use? He used parables. He used stories because he knew that we relate to the world through our senses. So he told us stories about shepherds and about sowers and about men who had runaway sons and about fishermen. Because everybody could say, oh yeah, I know somebody like that. You can get a picture in your mind of what he was talking about, and you could then appropriate the message. And so we're very physical people, aren't we? We're very physical. We relate to the world through our senses. And so one of the great gifts of our church is the gift that the Lord gave us of these sacraments. Because what a sacrament is, the first main ingredient of a sacrament is that it's a visible sign of some invisible reality. It's something that we can see or perceive with our eyes, and it's intended to tell us something that we can't see, some invisible reality. So think about when you go to a baptism, for example. Everybody's been to a baptism. So you go to a baptism and you see water poured on a person and the person anointed with oil. The visible sign you're seeing is that sense of water, that sense of pouring. And what it's trying to communicate to you is that person is being cleansed of sin, being welcomed through the christening, being welcomed into the family of Christ. Very, very vivid. So it's a visible sign, invisible reality. When we go to Mass, you see bread and wine transformed into the body and blood of Christ. It's a visible sign of that not only is this food to nourish us, but it's done in the context of a meal to say that Christ wants to be in us and wants us to be the people of God, a family. Very symbolic. And so the words have great meaning, okay? The symbols have great meaning. We also believe that these symbols are what we call efficacious, meaning that it's not just symbolic, but it really does bring about what it signifies. So when we go to that baptism, when we see that water poured, we really believe this is happening right now, That person is being cleansed of sin, is being purified right now. And so these signs are efficacious. And the third element is that it gives grace, that undeserved help to live the life that God wants us to live. So we could go through all of the sacraments. I just mentioned a couple of them, but we won't go through all of them. But then we get to the sacrament of marriage. What's the sign of the sacrament of marriage? What's that visible sign that communicates an invisible reality? Nobody's going to pour water on you. Nobody's going to anoint you with oil. The rings aren't necessarily essential. Rings are nice, but some people don't like to wear rings, and they can still be a sign. So the key is, you're the sign. You're the sign. You're the sign. The couple themselves is the sign. Wow. That's such a lofty principle that in the sacrament of matrimony, this is the only sacrament where the priest or deacon is not the minister of the sacrament. The couple ministers the sacrament to one another. The priest or deacon is just the official witness of the church. The couple is the minister of the sacrament because the couple becomes the sign of the sacrament. It's pretty lofty, pretty scary. It's pretty lofty. So when you look at our sacraments here at the bottom of page 20, they can be grouped into three categories: sacraments of initiation, like baptism, confirmation; sacraments of healing, like reconciliation; and then sacraments of vocation. And of which there are two, we call them the lifestyle sacraments: matrimony and holy orders. And so What we like to say in these vocational sacraments of matrimony and holy orders, you don't just receive the sacrament on that day that you are married or ordained, but on that day you enter into a lifestyle that is supposed to be sacramental. So the graces of the sacraments should be just as vibrant, hopefully, God willing, 30 days or 30 years after your marriage as they are on your wedding day. Because you're living a sacramental life. You didn't just receive a sacrament, you entered into a sacrament. You entered into a sacramental life. And that's a very different way of thinking that a lot of our couples had never approached before. So what we want to reflect on, the rest of this presentation, is a focus on what does a sacramental life look like. You know what a wedding mass looks like, but what does a sacramental life look like after you leave the church? And in order to reflect on that, we turn to the source of our great teaching on the theology of marriage, and that's from St. Paul's letter to the Ephesians. And so it's down here on page 121, and I'll usually pick this up and read this verbatim here. So we'll read it as we go. Defer to one another out of reverence to Christ. Wives, submit to your husbands as to the Lord, for the husband is head of his wife, as Christ is head of the church, his body, of which he is the Savior. Now, as the church submits to Christ, so also wives should submit to their husbands in everything. And I'll usually make this little parenthetical comment here, because often when you do see this in church, you see the husband sort of goad the wife here with the elbow, but the rest of this is far more challenging for men than this first part was for women. For Paul goes on to say, husbands, love your wives as Christ loves the church. He gave himself up for her. You know what that looks like? He gave himself up for her to make her holy. Cleansing her, here it is. Yeah. This is what it looks like. This is what it looks like. He gave himself up for her. Some of our great Spanish mystics, John of the Cross and others, referred to the cross as Christ's marriage bed. This is where he gave it up for us, the church. So he gave himself up for her to make her holy, cleansing her by the washing with water, without stain or wrinkle or any other blemish, but holy and blameless. And in this way, husbands ought to love their wives as they do their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. After all, no one ever hated his own body, but he feeds and cares for it just as Christ does the church. For we are members of his body. And for this reason, a man will leave his father and mother, be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. You recognize that passage again from Genesis. This is a profound mystery. I'm talking about Christ and the church. So what St. Paul is challenging us to in that reading, and Pope John Paul II referred to this as the summa of marriage, the highest expression of marriage is contained in this reading. What he's challenging us to in this reading, it's not about the husband's on the throne and the wife's on a footstool. Remember the first sentence there, that's so critical. Defer to one another out of reverence for Christ. He's calling us to a mutual, profound respect, a mutual deference to one another out of reverence for Christ. And within that context, he's challenging us to really a very sacrificial love, particularly for husbands, a very sacrificial love that's modeled after the way Christ loved the church. Beautiful passage, but our experience has been that, when you try to apply that, that's sort of the vision at 30,000 feet. When you try to bring it low, what does that mean? How does Christ love the church? Sometimes people hear that and they think of the bricks and mortar church over here, or they think of the institutional church or the popes and the cardinals and bishops and so forth. But I think to really understand this reading and to really get a picture of what a sacramental lifestyle looks like, we have to take it down a step and recognize that church at its core is a community of believers. And Jesus ministered to a church. So if we want to know what it looks like, if we're going to love one another as Christ loved the church, his first group of believers, his first group of followers, all we have to do is look in the Gospels for clues on what sort of attributes and qualities did Jesus demonstrate in the way he dealt with his church, and what does that say to us about what it should be like in our marriage relationship. So what we're going to do is we're going to identify a number of qualities that we see in the Gospels, and we're going to refer to some scripture passages. We aren't going to read scripture. We're going to refer to some passages that most couples have probably heard from going to church over the years, and we're going to talk about those qualities that are evident there and how they apply to us.
And we liken it to like when you were a kid and you did paint by number or color by number. What we're going to do is try to fill in the shading so that a picture emerges of what it looks like to live a sacramental marriage. And so what we're going to do is talk about specific qualities or virtues that, if, as long as we can develop them in our interactions with one another, then we'll be treating each other the same way Christ treats the church, okay? So that obviously we could spend the rest of, the next month talking about different qualities and stories that Christ gives us. But we're going to tell them that, we tell our couples, we're going to give you a handout that's got about 10 of these qualities. We're only going to go over a couple of them in marriage preparations, 4 or 5 in marriage preparation itself. But we're going to give you a handout so that you can look at your own relationship over the course of your married life and try to keep tabs on how you're developing, how you're growing in virtue as a married couple, so that you're exhibiting those same qualities with which Christ loved his church. So I'll usually start and I'll say that the first 2 qualities I'm going to talk about are qualities that we've talked a lot about in marriage preparation. And I'll tell them, you're probably going to laugh when I tell you these 2. The 2 qualities are openness and intimacy, because we've talked so much about open communication and sharing your feelings. Well, Jesus says in John's Gospel, chapter 15, he says to his apostles, I no longer call you slaves, I call you my friends, because I've told you everything that the Father gave to me. Now, can you imagine that Jesus, who was with the Father in prayer and who shares the same nature as the Father, the divine nature, he was saying to his apostles and to all of us that he didn't hold anything back. Whatever the Father was communicating to him, he gave to his apostles, who then gave it to us in the scriptures and in the church. So what a great example of being open. Again, holding nothing back. There's no contraception in the way Christ gives himself to the church. He gives himself totally for the bride. He gives himself in a total act of self-donation, even to the point of this tremendous emotional intimacy. And so it's a call to us to imitate Christ by not holding anything back from one another. And I talk about how we've had to grow in emotional intimacy, especially Lloyd developing a greater facility to talk about his feelings and to share his feelings. Because when we first were married, for the first 10 years of our marriage, Lloyd often felt like, well, if there was a feeling that arose in him that he didn't like, that was negative, or he wasn't proud of it, he said, I have a little internal fire extinguisher that I just, okay, I don't have that feeling anymore, and he wouldn't share it. And, me, I'm the feeler, so I'm sharing every kind of feeling there is. And so, we had to grow, he had to grow in that ability to be open. And likewise, I have to maintain a real openness to listening to him, to receiving what he brings to me, and also in sharing myself. And so we talk about that growth in intimacy. Growth in openness. And then intimacy, which is the second quality that I want to talk about. This handout that we gave them, we can talk about it here, but in the handout that's in the homeworks that we gave them on the many experiences of intimacy, it breaks intimacy down into about, 12 or 15 types of intimacy. Because most of the time when people say intimacy, they think of sex, physical intimacy. But intimacy, if you think about intimacy, there's lots of ways we're intimate with one another. Recreational intimacy, conflict intimacy, communication intimacy, spiritual intimacy, physical intimacy, emotional intimacy, all the different kinds of intimacy, ascetic intimacy, work intimacy, crisis intimacy. And so you think about the way Jesus was intimate with his apostles. He fished with them, he taught them, he went to weddings with them. He settled their arguments about who was the greatest, you know. They'd be walking along behind Jesus, and he says, what are y'all talking about? He says, oh, well, we're talking about who's the greatest in the kingdom. And so he uses that as a teaching moment right there to say, no, you got it all wrong. It's he who serves. So Jesus was intimate in every way with his apostles. Even at the Last Supper, John, who was the youngest of the apostles and very the closest to Jesus' heart, lays his head on Jesus' chest in a type of camaraderie, an evidence of physical friendship that is an expression of a deep intimacy with one another. And so it is that the more we try to grow in every area that's available to us of being intimate, so that again, we're working for that PhD on each other, with each other, we grow in all the ways of being intimate. Now that doesn't mean that just because I like to go to, ballet, that Lloyd has to go to every ballet with me because he doesn't like ballet. But we can share some of the other arts or music or that kind of thing and grow in aesthetic intimacy, finding a common bond with each other and growing intimate. And so intimacy and openness are two of the qualities that I appreciate about Jesus and try to model.
So I'll give you another example of how we would do it. So compassion is one that we always use. Now, notice when we talk about these, you have several bullets here, several options to choose from. You don't need to go over all of these. Pick a story that you particularly like that shows Jesus' compassion. I like the first one there. I use this one all the time, the widow of Nain. So Jesus was a very compassionate person. He had the ability to feel with, to sense when someone was in need, when someone was hurting. And so here we have in this story of the widow of Nain, he's walking through a village. It wasn't his destination. He's just passing through, and it comes upon the funeral procession, the only son of a widowed mother. Now, in the Jewish culture of that day, if a woman had lost her husband, she was taken in by her son, because women had little power or influence in that era. So this woman, presumably, she was a widow. She presumably had been living with this son. She had one son. He just died. And so she's obviously feeling not only grief at the loss of her son, she's probably a high degree of anxiety. What's going to happen to me? She was going to be dependent on handouts from the synagogue. And so it's one of those rare stories in Scripture where nobody asked Jesus to do anything. Jesus just looks at the situation. He has pity on the woman. He stops the funeral procession. He raises the young man back to life and gives him to the mother and walks on. Just a random act of total compassion, total kindness. Now, compassion in a marriage is difficult because it means that one of you is really hurting. So Jan and I have had to deal with the issues of both losing our mothers along the way. We both have lost brothers. We've had a miscarriage. We've had issues with, family challenges or some breach in the extended family that we've had to work through, or friendships. There are times when we would get together and one of us is really hurting and really needs the other to lean on, needs the other to hold. And it's often not at a convenient time for everybody, So when we make that sacrifice to be compassionate to our spouse, kind of put aside our own agenda and be compassionate because this is what our spouse needs from us, we're modeling Jesus. This is what Jesus would do. This is how Jesus loved the church, and this is how we can live a sacramental life.
And we ask Father to say, Father, compassion is your stock in trade. And so Father will often talk about, I got home the other night, back up to my bedroom. It was 11 o'clock. I was so tired. I crawl in bed, and 12 o'clock the phone rings, and it's somebody at the hospital that needs anointing, And he said, I need to go to the hospital and be compassionate to the family. And so we talk about how that's a model of Christ, love for the church. And you'll see on page 124, forgiveness is another one that we always like to tell the story of how Jesus was forgiving. When you think about Jesus, he spent 3 years with all of these men, being intimate with them, traveling, teaching with them, loving them, and in the end, they all deserted him. John was the only one at the foot of the cross, but Peter denied him, Judas betrayed him, and he comes back after he's resurrected from the dead, and he enters the upper room where they were. Now, you or me, we might have said, jerks. Where were you when I needed you? I thought you were my friends. And Jesus never castigates them. He simply says, peace, peace be with you. So he is a model for me of forgiveness, of wiping the slate clean, of not holding it over Lloyd's head when he hurts my feelings or something and I want to make him pay for it. Forgiveness means I not only say to Lloyd when I've goofed up, I'm sorry, but Lloyd, I really realize I hurt your feelings. Please forgive me. Or I really made a mistake, and please forgive me. And it's an opportunity to share that kind of forgiveness with one another. And in that, we're practicing a Christ-like quality. Healing is another one, number 5. And I always tell the story. We will tell a story of how many times you read in the Gospels Jesus restoring sight or healing a deaf man or raising lepers, healing the lepers or so forth. And I always tell the story about when we lived up in New Jersey, Lloyd had gone to the Y one Saturday morning to work out, and I had the 2 children, the little ones, at home, and all of a sudden I get a call from Lloyd, and he said, you better come pick me up, I'm starting to get a migraine. So he suffers with migraine. So I threw the kids in the car. They were about 6 and 4 at the time. And I said to them, listen, Daddy's getting one of his bad headaches, and we got to go pick him up. And so we're going to start praying right now that Jesus would heal our daddy. So, the kids are like saying Hail Marys and Our Father and asking Jesus to heal Daddy, and we don't want Daddy to have a headache, and they're going on and on. It was just great. And we drive up to the Y, and Lloyd comes down the steps, and he looks at us, and he said, y'all must have been praying because I'm completely pain-free. And I'm going, yes! And the kids are cheering God and all that kind of stuff. But I said to them, I always say that example, but say, for me, it was an example of how our love for one another in the sacrament can bring healing through our prayers, through our petitions to God, and also our very presence with one another. The day that Lloyd's mom died, again, we were just married a month, and my being there with Lloyd, walking down the hall that day with the doctor, and the doctor telling us that death was imminent, and just being with him, holding him, holding his hand, that was comforting to him. My very love for him and my presence was a healing presence, and so that is a Christ-like quality we can give to one another.
So hopefully, we go back to the image Jan used earlier about the paint by number set. Hopefully this picture's starting to take hold. So some of these qualities that we see in Jesus that are noble and valuable take on a sacramental quality when we apply them to each other, because we're modeling Jesus in the way we treat each other. So hopefully this picture's coming into focus. So we may very well, cover maybe 5 or so of these qualities, but we always end with number 8 here, this one on page 125, the issue of servanthood, because I think this is a quality of Jesus that is most applicable and most endearing to us. When Jesus is asked to describe himself, he often refers to himself as servant. He says, I stand among you as the one who serves, or I did not come to be served, but to serve, to give my life as ransom for many. The greatest among you is the one who serves the rest. He's always talking about service. He's always talking about giving of himself. And one of the most vivid examples of this, I think, is the washing of the feet story. So here, again, you're in an age when people didn't bathe regularly. They wore, open-toed sandals, and they walked around streets that were not well paved and irrigated and had farm animals, and you get the idea what people's feet look like. You couldn't, if you were a Jewish slave, you couldn't be compelled to wash another person's feet. And yet, here's Jesus. Before he institutes the Eucharist, he's on his knees washing the feet of these people. What a humbling task. And as you read that story, we read it every Holy Thursday night, as you read that story, you just are overwhelmed with how stunned the apostles were experiencing this. They just, nobody would do this. What is he doing? And as I envision that scene, I bet you could hear a pin drop as he went around person to person and washed each of their feet. Even Judas, who had not left the dinner yet, you know. I always said if I could be an artist or a sculptor, that would be the picture I would want to do. You know, Jesus washing the feet of Judas and the look in there between their eyes, you know. But he finishes and he puts on his robe, and I'm sure his robe was filthy, you know, after just about 3 or 4 people. He puts his robe back on, and their eyes are riveted on him, and he says, "Do you know what I just did for you? You call me teacher and Lord, and fittingly so, for that is who I am. But if I, your teacher and Lord, have washed your feet, you must wash one another's feet. I've given you an example. As I have done, so you must do." Wow. Wow. To be a foot washer. Somebody said recently, and I thought it was true, he said, the most challenging words in the Bible are, love one another as I have loved you. Oh, wow. Can we have a lower standard, huh, to try to reach for? Love one another as I have loved you. So here is Jesus, the foot washer. You know, being a foot washer is not a popular, vocation today. You know, we're in an age that's been called the me generation, and everybody's looking for self-actualization and self-fulfillment, and if I don't get my needs met, I'm out of here. And here is this image of a foot washer. A foot washer. You can go to a magazine and you'll find magazines called Self. You know, it's just, we're very much in an ego-centered world, and here's Jesus as a foot washer. So humble, so giving, and so literally sometimes we have to be foot washers for one another. So as we look at the principles of the sacrament, we said a sacrament was a visible sign of an invisible presence. You, the couple, are called to be that visible sign. The invisible presence is that your reality is you're trying to model the way Christ loves us and the way you show love for each other. Coincidentally, the priest has the exact same objective in his sacrament of holy orders. He's trying to model Christ and the way Christ loves his people and the way he loves the people. You know, that's why it's good to have both of us there. We have the same goal. Secondly, the sign is efficacious. So to the extent that we try to live this vision out of loving as Christ loved and demonstrate that love, it brings about a sense of holiness. It erodes our sense of selfishness. And thirdly, it is an instrument of grace. The Lord needs the witness of your sacrament. He is so eager to pour out his grace upon you that he's going to continue to pour this grace out as long as we continue to try to make this journey. So don't believe that people aren't watching, because they are. They are watching your marriage. The marriage is not just for the good of the couple, it's for the couple and the whole church to be that witness.
All right, and then we usually tell a little story. We came home from a trip one time and we're listening to the messages on our recorder, and this woman's voice comes on and says, Jan, you don't know me, but I go to the same church that you all do every week, and I watch you and your husband, and you all look like you love each other. And I don't have that in my marriage, and I was wondering if I could come talk to you. Oh. I was like, oh, wow. And Lloyd and I kind of looked at each other, and again, it was like the Lord saying, you see, that stuff y'all talk about? It's true. People are watching. And so it is that we have to be aware that the way we speak to one another, the way we look at one another, the way we treat one another is important, because the world needs to see a marriage, a sacrament, fully alive.
And a couple that came on a recent married couple retreat that we did came all the way from Plano down to New Orleans to come to a married couple retreat because they were touched by Jody and Adam Todd. They had a dinner with them, and they said, how did you guys learn to relate to this way? You know, they saw something in their marriage. They saw something in the way they treated each other that said, I got to learn more about how to do this, and they came on retreat.
Like you want to do the Stephanie's story?
No.
Okay. All right, so if you turn to page 127.
Enough.
Yeah, page 127. We just want to highlight this at the top here. The goal of marriage is to model the love of Christ, and then you must recognize that Jesus must be the invisible third partner in your marriage. And we give you 2 examples of how Jesus has to be part of your marriage, and that's why we really do talk to every couple about developing a couple prayer life and praying together every day. We talk about that. There's a section on interfaith marriage that you can read if you have that.
If that's appropriate.
If that's appropriate. Okay, so if you see on page 128 in the box, respond to any questions that the couple may have. and then you give them 5 or 10 minutes to share privately on the reflection of the vows. So we usually tell them, we're going to leave you now, we're going to go in the other room and set up for a little closing prayer service, and you all share your letters. And the way you're going to do this is groom, you're going to read your letter first to your bride, and then bride, you read your letter. And when y'all finish, come in the other room. We have a little candle and things set up, and we do a closing prayer service with them, which is on page 129 in the manual. Now, the last thing you're going to do, okay, that you are responsible for is on page 132 and 133. Let's just look at page 133. It's a sample letter. You have to write a letter that both you and your husband or you and your wife have to sign to the priest who is responsible, or deacon who's responsible for the wedding. And you make note, you write exactly how it is, and then like the first couple of sentences down through listing all the topics. And then, although they completed the sessions, we have some special concerns. And then you would relate anything that you noticed in the relationship that you had to deal with that causes you some concerns. And then you send this letter, give this letter to the priest or deacon. Now, why do we do that? This letter goes into their official fold transcript, their, what do you call it, their files. If they ever had to have annulment proceedings or anything, they would have a record that said that the couple who prepared them noted that there were problems from the beginning in these specific areas. So, and then you give the priest this letter and any materials that you have on the couple, the notes you've taken, the focus instrument, anything that you've collected over the weeks of doing with them. And then you turn them back over to Father, and you're on your own after that with them.
So one comment, and then we'll throw it open to any last questions. So I'm sure at this point you're feeling a little overwhelmed and say, oh my gosh, you know, how do I begin to start on this? If you try to go through every single section and think about what am I going to say and what are my notes going to be, you'll never get a couple. You know, so what we encourage you to do is to look at through the first 2, maybe 3 sections, and once you feel comfortable, like again, family of origin, if that was new and fresh for you, do some of those homeworks. Think about how you would share your story of family of origin. If the theology of the body was something that's really foreign to you and you feel like I really need to learn this a little better, look at some of those books and do some backup reading. But don't expect to get through the whole manual before you start your first couple. Maybe get 2 or 3 and then just sort of stay ahead of them, 2 or 3 sections and stay ahead of them. The couples who've done the ministry tell us that the first couple they kind of stumble through, but if you really enjoy it, the second couple they feel much more comfortable with, and by the third couple they're having a blast. They really are enjoying it. And the more you do it, I mean, once you get to about the third couple, you probably won't need your notes hardly as much anymore. You'll remember the points, you remember the outline, you remember the stories you want to share. So this will be a wonderful time for the 2 of you just preparing some of these topics and looking at some of these homeworks and talking about some of these. So our contact information is in the front of the manual. If you have any, and our email's there, if you have any questions that come up and maybe confusions,
It's on the back
of page 1. Yeah. Feel free to reach out to us, and you know, sometimes people call with just a question, we'll talk over the phone, or sometimes it's an email. Any